Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring Artemis and the Amazons. With me is philosopher Jason Reza Jorjani, who is the author of Prometheus and Atlas, as well as World State of Emergency, Lovers of Sophia, and Novel Folklore. Welcome once again, Jason.
Always good to be with you, Jeff.
It's a real pleasure to be with you as well. Artemis is a goddess from the ancient world, and you point out that she really originated amongst the Persian peoples.
Yes, among the Iranian peoples. So, the Persians are one group of Iranians. And above the Persian Empire created by Cyrus and maintained by Darius and his other successors, there was a realm ruled over by semi-nomadic Iranian tribes who were Scythians and Sar Nations. They're closely related to one another. And the people who were mythologized by the Greeks as the Amazons were Sarmatian tribesmen and women. And the women played comparable roles in the society to men, including as warriors, as horseback archers. And I think this struck the patriarchal Greeks as so fantastical that these warrior women were mythologized as Amazons.
Now, so the Sarmatians are actually the people who have been mythologized by the Greeks as Amazons.
Excavations around the Black Sea region, which is where, in the Greek myths, Greek male heroes would encounter the Amazons and have battles with them. Excavations in that region around the Black Sea have revealed tombs of women buried with their armor, warrior women who were part of the Iranian Sarmatian society. And according to Greek legends, it's these women who founded the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, the original Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, which is one of the seven wonders of the ancient world.
And even today, if people visit Ephesus and the museum there, they can see some of the original sculptures, maybe not from the first temple, but from temples that are thousands of years old, of the goddess Artemis, but not as a warrior goddess.
Yes, well, Artemis had a number of different roles in the Sarmatian culture. For example, and some of them are rather paradoxical. She is a goddess of the hunt. She's also referred to as the nurse, which is interesting because she's a virgin goddess. And she's referred to as well as the light bearer or the light bringer. One symbol of her cult was the crescent and the star. And the star there is not a star, it's really the planet Venus, which in its guise as the morning star is referred to as Lucifer, or the light bringer. So Artemis is the light bearer, the light bringer, which makes her in some ways equivalent to Prometheus in Greek mythology.
Well, people who would visit Ephesus, as many tourists do, would, I think the most prominent feature of the available images of Artemis is that she has many, many breasts.
Yeah, and that may be a reference to the nurse role, but there's also been some debate about whether those are actually testicles, because the practice of castration was part of the cult of Artemis. It was initially a cult maintained by priestesses. And later on, as males aspired to lead this religious cult, they would try to feminize themselves in order to take on the psychic abilities and intuitive power of women.
And by castrating themselves.
And I think that this finds its way into the Greek myths about the Amazons and the Greek fears about, what will be done to men who fell into the hands of the Amazons.
Well, and I understand historically it was one of these Sarmatian warrior queens who actually decapitated the great conquering founding emperor of the Persian Empire, Cyrus.
So as I mentioned, people talk about the Persian Empire as if it's coextensive with all of Iran, with all of the Iranian realm.
Yes.
But that's not true. There's this vast Iranian realm above the Persian Empire, which resisted the Persian Empire. And these are both the Sarmatians and the closely related Scythians. And their realm stretches all the way from the Black Sea and the Caucasus in the west to the borders of China, to the Gobi Desert in the east. So as Cyrus tried to expand the northern borders of the Persian Empire, he ran into a group of Sarmatians called the Massagetai on the eastern coast of the Caspian Sea in northern Iran. And he was stopped by the Amazon queen, Tomiris, or Tahmureish, or Tahm-Raish, I believe is how it was pronounced by those Iranians. And she decapitates him in a one-to-one combat on the battlefield, and then takes his severed head and plunges it into her wineskin full of blood. So that's significant because, Cyrus has this reputation as a great humanitarian, as some people put it, the founder of human rights, the ideology of human rights. And his empire generally expanded through benevolent liberations of people who were living under tyrannical governments. He was extremely lenient in how he dealt with conquered peoples. So we get a different perspective from this Iranian queen of the Sarmatian realms, who I believe says to his severed head as she plunges it into the wineskin, "Drink your fill, you bloodlusting bastard." So Iranian history is broader and richer than simply the history of the Persians.
I see, but this is a good example of an actual victorious Amazon warrior conquering, well, not conquering, but decapitating.
She stopped the greatest military conqueror in human history up to that time. This is a man who founded the first true empire in recorded history. He conquered and integrated 4 or 5 relatively strong kingdoms. None of their kings could stop him, but this woman did.
Including the Assyrians, for example.
Including Croesus of Lydia, who was running the wealthiest kingdom on earth at the time. Well, Cyrus made him an advisor, a close advisor, another example of his benevolence.
Yes.
But evidently, this Amazon queen didn't consider him benevolent and wanted him and his Persians to get the hell out of there.
Yeah. So the worship of Artemis is related to these warrior females.
That's right. She appears to have been the central deity of their society. And it may have been in several different forms. And these were semi-nomadic people who did not have a centralized government. So their religion was also somewhat decentralized and probably had a number of different iterations. So the goddess figure at the center of their society also appears in the form of Shatana in the Caucasus Mountains. And there's a lot of serpentine imagery associated with this goddess who dwells under the water. The Gorgons in Greek mythology are beings that were worshipped both by the Sarmatians and by the Scythians. And Gorgonic characteristics define the imagery of Shatana. If you think about the fact that Artemis is associated with the morning star, with Lucifer.
Yes.
And then Shaitan is the word for Satan in the Semitic languages.
Yes.
And Shatana is the name of this goddess who's associated with serpentine imagery and so forth. It's interesting how this might relate to the myth of Satan, especially if we also take into account the fact that the banner of the Sarmatian people, their war banner, was a dragon standard. And I believe, given that we have records for the Sarmatians going back at least to 700 BC or so, I believe that it's the Sarmatians who carried the symbol of the dragon, both to the west into Europe and to the east into China. In Persian mythology, in books like the Shahnameh, you have legends of dragon-slaying heroes, as you do in the medieval chivalric culture. And in a moment, we'll talk about the connection between these two chivalric cultures. But you have these myths of dragon slaying. And I think every time you have a Persian knight go up against a dragon in the myths preserved by Ferdowsi in the Shahnameh, what you're really seeing is combat between Persians and Sarmatians.
Because the dragon was their banner.
It was their war banner.
Their war banner.
And, you know, you have these similar stories of dragon slaying in Europe. The interesting thing there is, though, I mentioned Shatana. Her cult is centered in the Caucasus Mountains, particularly in Ossetia. Today's Ossetia is the last between Georgia and Russia. It's divided between South Ossetia and North Ossetia along the Georgian-Russian border. Ossetia is the last remnant of the Sarmatian culture. They speak a language that's descended from the Sarmatian language. That's an Iranian language, which they call Iran, and they refer themselves as Irani, the Iranian people.
I recall the word Iran can also be pronounced Ilan.
Yes, so you have these people who referred themselves as the Arani people. That area in the Caucasus was called Aran, which is a cognate of Iran. In other words, the Aryan realm.
Yes.
And in Iranian linguistics, the R and the L sometimes become interchangeable. So Arani became Alani. And these Sarmatians who migrated into Europe were referred to in Europe as the Alans. And they brought the chivalric culture into Europe, beginning around 150 AD in the time of Marcus Aurelius, and extending all the way into the mass barbarian invasions of the Roman Empire. In some cases, these Alans rode together with Goths, together with Germans, all the way across Europe as far west as Spain, where they set up the kingdom of Gothulania or Catalonia. At any rate, if you look at the symbols and rituals of the chivalric culture of medieval Europe, whether it's the sword and the stone, the role of powerful land-owning ladies, the Knights of the Round Table, and the Lady of the Lake, for example, in the Arthurian mythos, you see all of these themes appear earlier in the culture of the Sarmatians between the Black Sea and the Caucasus. So it appears that the chivalric culture was transmitted by the Sarmatians from the Iranian realms into medieval Europe.
Well, with the Alans who merged with the Goths and created what we now call Catalonia, were direct descendants or actually part of the Sarmatians?
They were Sarmatians. There's no distinction.
So when you say the Sarmatians extended from all the way to the Caucasus, if they got to Catalonia, that's in Spain. That's much farther.
It's incredible. These people were on the border of China in the Gobi Desert, and they were in Spain. There's no great... Of course, they were an exemplary horseback riding culture who were famous for archery. They were the greatest, together with the Scythians, who are their close relatives, they were the greatest archers in human history. And that's relevant to Artemis again, because remember that in the cult of Artemis, she's often depicted as an archer, as the huntress goddess holding the bow and arrow.
Like Diana.
Yeah, Diana is the Roman iteration of Artemis. And so her attributes, her holding the bow and arrow, reflects the main war implement of the Sarmatian culture. But it's also a symbol with a metaphysical significance. In the fragments of Heraclitus, who Greek thinker who took refuge in the temple of Artemis at Ephesus, you find the bow and arrow as a symbol for the dynamic tension between polar opposites at work in nature. It's the idea that life reaches its aim and hits its target through this dialectical tension between opposing forces.
Now, let me slow down a little bit and unpack that. We're talking now about Heraclitus, who is regarded by many as perhaps the first of the Greek philosophers.
Yes, and Heraclitus was famously invited by Darius the Great, the emperor of the Persian Empire, to become the court philosopher of Iran, an offer that he refuses, and he decides instead to sequester himself in the temple of Artemis. The context for this was an Athenian organized revolt against the Persian governorship of Ephesus, which was a city in the Persian Empire. And so what we're seeing here is that, Darius must have considered Heraclitus to be an exemplar of Iranian values, for him to have afforded Heraclitus the opportunity to speak for the entire Persian Empire as the court philosopher of Iran. But in Heraclitus's refusal, we may also be seeing a distinction between two different types of Iranian spirituality. The Zoroastrianism of the Achaemenids, on the one hand, and this perhaps older, more tribal belief in the attributes of the goddess Artemis.
Well, what role does the goddess play in Zoroastrian theology?
Not a very large one. There are feminine angels in Zoroastrian theology. There are feminine angels like the angel associated with earth, and the inner conscience is depicted as feminine and so forth. But, you know, Zoroastrianism, as we've discussed in other conversations we've had, Zoroastrianism is sort of abstract, monotheizing, universalist theology. It is already a move beyond what in the West is referred to as paganism. Whereas the Sarmatians were Iranian pagans, goddess-worshipping Iranian pagans. And I think some of the ideas that you find in Zoroastrianism in terms of the polar opposition of conflicting forces in nature, or fire as a metaphor for cosmic order, which you see in the fragments of Heraclitus, and you see fire have a prominent role in the cult of Artemis as well. These are commonalities between this older pagan Iranian belief and Zoroastrianism. But I would imagine that, like for example, a lot of the myths in the Nart sagas, the sagas of the Sarmatians in the Caucasus, the Alans, parallel mythic structures in the Shahnameh. In fact, Rostam is a hero in both.
Now, the Shahnameh, for benefit of our viewers who may not remember, is the Book of Kings.
That's right.
In Iran, it's sort of the great historical work of Iranian culture.
That's right. And Rostam, who's like the Odysseus of the Shahnameh, is also in the Nart sagas. But there are no references to Zoroastrianism in the Nart sagas, whereas there are in the Shahnameh. So what this suggests is that there was a common mythic tradition that branched off in two different directions. And when you see Tomyris, for example, resisting Cyrus, you're seeing an older form of Iranian society resisting certain innovations on the part of the Persians.
And now you referred earlier to the Arthurian legends in England. And the Lady of the Lake, for example, and there are many myths concerning the powerful priestesses of the Lady of the Lake, Morgan Le Fay, who had many magical powers, and much of this has been resurrected by the novelist Marion Zimmer Bradley in her book The Mists of Avalon, and a series of novels like that. For example, this also, you're saying, can be traced back to the Sarmatians, so that they're influence not only extended to Catalonia, but into Britain.
The greatest study of this, which I reference actually in my chapters on Iranian civilization in World State of Emergency, the greatest study of this transmission of the chivalric tradition and the Arthurian mythos to Europe is called From Scythia to Camelot. And it discusses how Marcus Aurelius captured a group of these Sarmatians and or Scythians and sent them to Hadrian's Wall. So they were rapidly transported all the way to Britain.
And I gather you regard the Scythians as nearly equivalent to the Sarmatians.
Yeah, so I mentioned Nart sagas, right? Now the word saga appears to be of Iranian and particularly Scythian origin. The Scythian name for the Scythians is Saka. That's where we get Scythian from, Saka. And like R and L, G and K are interchangeable in the Iranian languages. So Saka could also be Saga. And Sag is the word for dog. These were people who created the first hunting dogs. They were a hunting culture and they created the first hunting dogs. So you find the adjective Sagzi, dog people, as descriptive of the Scythians in Persian literature.
I see.
Rostam is called Rostam-e-Sagzi, Rostam the Scythian. So yes, the Scythians and the Sarmatians are very closely related people. They were more closely related to each other than either were to the Persians. But they're all Iranian peoples.
And so by virtue of the fact that Heraclitus, one of the first, if not the first great, he's regarded as a Greek philosopher, but you're suggesting he was really, in many ways, quite Persian, took refuge in the temple of Artemis, and so his philosophy was very much influenced by these people.
Yes, it's unfortunate that all we have left are fragments. Heraclitus vouchsafed his book on nature, that's what it was called, to the priestesses of the temple of Artemis. But all we have left are the fragments that were quoted by other classical authors, thanks to the Christian destruction of the literary heritage of classical antiquity. It's too bad that we aren't able to reconstruct the mysticism, the cosmology of the Sarmatian people from out of texts like the complete text of Heraclitus's writings on nature.
But I guess it's fair to say, I mean, most people who study philosophy understand that he believed in process when he talked about fire as the basic element of the universe. He's basically saying everything is change, everything is process.
Yes, and in a way that suits the mentality of semi-nomadic people who the Sarmatians were. And another significant difference, I think, here is that, the idea of opposing forces, of a duality at work in nature, appears both in the writings of Heraclitus and perhaps in the Sarmatian culture, and in Zoroastrianism. But in Zoroastrianism, it's also reflected in terms of ethical dualism, conflict between, say, good and evil, right? Whereas in Heraclitus, it's more the sense of the yin and the yang. It's more a Taoist type duality, which is interesting also because, the Chinese referred to the ancient Chinese, including Lao Tzu himself, referred to the earliest rulers of China as the Dragon Kings and the Phoenix Queens. And we have found these remains of Iranian peoples in northwestern China, what's today northwestern China.
Mummified remains, as I recall.
Mummified, so we can see clearly their hair color, their eye color, and so on, so their phenotype. And also the fabric, the clothes they're wearing are Iranian. Iranians invented trousers, particularly these northern Iranians, more than the Persians, because they were horseback riders. So these Iranians buried in China, they're wearing trousers, the fabric is Iranian in design, and they have a certain phenotype that's the same phenotype as the Sarmatians. The Sarmatians were also referred to as Rokhsalan, which means basically like blonde people. And so the blonde Alans, the white Alans. So it's interesting to wonder also whether this idea of the yin and the yang, the polarity of opposites at work in nature, may have been one that, together with the dragon symbol, was carried to northwestern China by these Alans.
Well, just parenthetically, I seem to recall that the oldest graphic image that we have of the yin-yang symbol is on a Roman shield.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Anyhow.
Well, that's very interesting because, it'd be good to look at the date for that.
Yeah.
Since, from about 150 onward, these Sarmatians were deeply penetrating the Roman Empire.
Yeah. Somewhere along the line, the Amazon warrior females lost that quality. They didn't persist as warriors. What we began to see, I gather, for example, in the Arthurian legends in particular, are priestesses who have great psychic and magical capabilities.
Yes, that's true, but you also see in the medieval culture ladies who are lordesses of their own realms, who are property holders, which is extremely rare in the patriarchal culture of Europe, but it has this precedent in the Sarmatian culture, and frankly also in Persian culture. In the ancient Persian Empire, women were landowners. And these lordesses are also the ones ordaining the knights, who are, serving the various knights, giving them knighthood, and they're sworn to protect these ladies. And these ladies were also surrounded by bards, by troubadours.
Which is sort of the birth of our Western notion of romance.
Yeah, you see, the Scythians were related to the people who then came down into the Persian Empire and established the Parthian dynasty, and they were Mithraists. And in Mithraism, there's this idea of love as a metaphysical concept of love, eshq. And the Parthian name for themselves, the Iranian name for the Parthians is Ashkanian. Ashk became Eshq when it was Arabized. So you have this culture of, how could I put it, mystical communion, divine love in Mithraic Iran.
Yeah.
And that was also probably part of what was transmitted to Europe through the Hellenic migrations.
Very interesting. Now, we've discussed earlier how the Zoroastrian tradition is associated with the Magi, the wise men, the astrologers, those who practice the occult arts, who show up around the time of the Nativity of Christ. But it also seems that the Sarmatians, who were not Zoroastrians, may have been practitioners of that tradition as well.
They certainly had some kind of magical tradition. And, you know, another thing I wanted to mention in that regard, because the dragon is such a powerful mystical symbol in numerous cultures, who were all on the periphery of the Sarmatian realm, namely Persian culture, European culture, Chinese culture. These are the three cultures on the Sarmatian periphery, and the dragon is a mystical symbol in all of them. I also wanted to mention something about the etymology of this word Sarmatian. So the Greeks said that the Sarmatians were the reptilian people. Sor, like in dinosaur, is the root of their word Saromatai, which they used to refer to the Sarmatians. And I think the reason, this isn't the actual etymology of Sarmat in Iranian, but the reason they saw them that way is not only because they carried a dragon standard, which is serpentine, but also because these were the first people that the Europeans ever saw wearing chainmail armor. The Iranians invented chainmail in general, both the Scythians and the Sarmatians. And the Sarmatians wore head to toe chainmail armor, which looks like snake scale or reptilian scales. And they also, as we know from the House of Karen in northern Iran on the coast of the Caspian Sea, they would sometimes cover these their chainmail armor, both on their body armor and on their horses, with green fabric. So that's very evocative of serpents and reptiles. So I mentioned that this etymology of the Sarmatians that was proposed by the Greeks, that it comes from reptile or lizard, the same root as dinosaur, sor, is not accurate in terms of Iranian etymology. The Sarmatians are, in fact, one of three groups of Iranians that are descended from the mythical king Fereydun. And this also explains to some extent where the dragon symbolism comes from. In the Shahnameh, Ferdowsi preserves the legend of a dragon king, Zahak, or in ancient Persian, Ajidahaka, ancient Iranian rather, Ajidahaka in the Avesta becomes Zahak in the Shahnameh. He is a tyrant who rules over all of Iran, and he has two serpents growing out of his shoulders who feed on human brains. And Zahak takes Fereydun's three daughters prisoner, and Fereydun, a champion and knight,
who is the mythical king,
who becomes king after he overthrows Zahak. He liberates his daughters, and he smashes Zahak's skull with a bull-headed mace, which symbolizes the planet Earth. And after he defeats Zahak and establishes his own kingdom and has his own sons, he eventually divides his kingdom in his will amongst his three sons, and one of them, Iraj, inherits central Iran. Another, Tur, inherits Central Asia, or Turan, named after him. And then the northwestern territories, the cold regions, Sarma is the word for cold in Persian. The cold regions, the Sarma regions, are inherited by Salm. So you have Salm, Iraj, and Tur. I had mentioned that in terms of Alan and Aran, you have this replacement of the R sound with an L sound,
Yes.
the flip back and forth between L and R phonetically. So the same thing happens with Salm, the son of Fereydun. Salm becomes Sarm. And so the people of Salm are the Sarmat. At is a plural in the Scythian and the Sarmatian language. So the Sarmat are the descendants of Salm, one of the three sons of the mythical king Fereydun.
And they become the Sarmatians.
That's right.
I see. And the Tur, I gather, might be related to the Turks.
Well, what happened is, the Turks, a lot of our viewers may not realize, had nothing to do with what's called Turkey today. They arrived there very late in their history. They were a very primitive, tribal, nomadic culture in the parts of the Siberian steppes close to China. And at a certain point, they invaded Central Asia, which was Turan, the realm of Tur. And because they didn't have a strong literary culture of their own, they appropriated the mythology of the Turanians. The Turanians in the Iranian language are referred to as Turk. The G means, or K means of Tur's people. So Turk meant descendants of Tur. And in fact, the Turks are not descendants of Tur at all. They were appropriating an Iranian mythology to sort of increase their gravitas and cultural standing. And then eventually, they wound up in Anatolia after conquering the Persian Empire.
Where they established an empire of their own.
Yes, but the point is the Sarmatians are the people of the cold lands to the northwest of Iran, the part of the greater Iranian or Aryan realm of Fereydun, which was inherited by Salm or Sarm.
We never hear about a Sarmatian empire extending all the way from China into Catalonia. What we hear about in terms of a huge, vast empire is the Mongol Empire that came much, much later. So although they held this territory or lived in this territory, did they actually administer it as an empire?
Absolutely not. Absolutely, and that's very key, is that one integral element of the chivalric culture of Europe, which was brought there by the Alans, is free-spiritedness and the sense that, I am the king of my own realm. This is where the term King of Kings comes from, meaning that the emperor, King of Kings, Shahanshah, is only a sort of chairman or, a chairman at a round table of knights. Each of whom are equal to one another. It's very egalitarian, federalist, feudalist understanding of the division of power. Not at all comparable to that of a centralized empire. And I think this is also a legacy of these semi-nomadic people who never established an empire. There was no Sarmatian empire from China into Europe. There was a Sarmatian federation of semi-nomadic people who moved around very rapidly on horseback. And I think one of the reasons they resisted Cyrus and his successors in the various Persian empires is because they had no desire to live under centralized authority. Free-spiritedness was very important to these people. In a way, it's the cowboy mentality. And these people are related to the cowboys. These people are Aryans who never mixed with any other culture. Whereas the Persians, when they came down into the Iranian plateau, they mixed with lots of Aryan cultures, the Elamites, the Babylonians, and so forth. The Sarmatians are Aryan sort of in their native element. And so it's a kind of interesting trans-temporal experiment, if you can imagine taking these people and putting them out in the American West, again, away from the centers of civilization in Europe, and seeing them revert to their native mode of being, right? So in a way, like the American cowboy and the strong American frontiers woman is very similar to the Sarmatian of ancient times.
Well, it's fascinating, Jason, because I would imagine most of our viewers maybe never even heard of the Sarmatians until now, and yet we can see they had an enormous influence on our notion of chivalry, our notion of romance, our notions concerning magic, and even I'm thinking of the process philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead, which is a very important modern philosopher who probably derived influence from Heraclitus.
Yes, and Heraclitus was the most revered thinker for Nietzsche, who said that the maxim of Zarathustra's people, Zoroaster's people's maxim, was to speak the truth and shoot well with arrows. He says that is Persian virtue. Well, it's actually more Sarmatian virtue than it is Persian virtue, because Artemis means truth the immortal, or immortal truth. Artemis is a contraction of Arta, truth or right order, and Amesha, or immortal. So, you know, the cowboys who say out in the American West, be a straight shooter, which doesn't just mean, you know, be a good shot. It also means speak the truth, because you fear nothing from anyone. They, again, parallel this Scythian and Sarmatian attitude toward life. Speak the truth and shoot well with arrows.
Jason, Reza Jorjani, once again, a very enlightening conversation.
Thank you, Jeffrey. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for being with me, and thank you for being with us.